All right, guys, we're back for another kind of subsection for our lecture on qualitative methods. And we're going to talk about kind of types of qualitative methods here in this section. Now, kind of the most famous, probably the original kind of qualitative research was fieldwork from the discipline that eventually became anthropology. And I actually got my first bachelor's degree in anthropology. So this is a field that really kind of fascinates me. But in the early days of anthropology, you would get these, usually rich white men from Europe who would travel out to the primitive tribes of, Africa and Asia and Pacific Islands and such, maybe Native American groups. And they would sit there and observe and kind of learn about these, again, primitive cultures, um, and then write up these journal articles and books and stuff to share with their other kind of rich white European colleagues because they found these groups fascinating, right? Now in the modern day, there's kind of three different subsets of if you're going to go observe a group, if you're going to go kind of learn something about a group. The two far more common are participant observation and complete observation. So with participant observation, kind of you're there doing the things the group does with them while observing how they do the things, right? So maybe I'm going to go join a protest group, right? There have been lots of major protest groups over the past few decades. I'm going to go join them. I'm going to, sit there in the camps, hold one of their signs and say, oh, yes, I absolutely agree with you, but I'm also, here trying to learn about your group. So can I talk to you? I'm so and so from such and such university. Um, I'd like to learn more about this while I'm here participating, doing the thing with you. Whereas complete observation, you're not participating. You're just kind of standing back in the corner, watching, taking notes, figuring out what people do. Maybe you're observing a meeting of some group, seeing who talks and how many times there's interruptions and who gets listened to and who doesn't get listened to and all those things. But you're not participating. You're not engaging with the group. You're just watching. In both those cases, you have to be aware of what are called reactive effects, right? So we talked a little bit about the Hawthorne effect in a previous section. That's basically what this is, right? The mere fact that people know they're being observed can change their behavior. if whether it's an individual or a group or whatever, if they know somebody's watching, if they know somebody's in the corner writing down their observations, that behavior is going to change. And it's going to change the most at the beginning, but as they kind of get used to your presence, hopefully that will lessen, hopefully even disappear altogether. But it's going to be a problem. It's going to be something you have to watch out for. It's going to be something you have to kind of take into account, right? So beware of these reactive effects. People act differently when they know there's somebody observing them, whether it's participant observation or complete observation, right? The third option here is by far the most rare because it has serious ethical considerations, and that's covert participation. This is where you ignore all those rules I talked about earlier in the section about disclosing your identity and who you are and what you're studying, and you go in kind of undercover, right? And these are very rare because they have obvious ethical concerns, but sometimes that's the only way research on a certain group can happen. If they knew it was a researcher, if they knew it was there was somebody there observing and documenting, they would never, ever allow it. And it's very important that we study this group, so maybe covert participation is the only possible way to do it, right? And this can be really difficult. It takes a special kind of researcher to do that kind of research, because you can't have recording devices. You can't write stuff down. Um, you can't have these obvious questions that's leading to you uh, uh, learning about what you're there to learn about. You might be able to kind of subtly ask questions the way a normal participant would at your position and at your level and of your stature. Um, but it can be really hard to not be able to ask the questions you would want to ask as a researcher because somebody in your position that wasn't a researcher wouldn't ask that, right? And then, of course, there's the whole bit about acting. You have to be able to act. You have to be able to pretend to be something you're not, which can be very, very difficult, right? So it's kind of very similar to like being an undercover police officer. You have to be able to act like something completely different from who you actually are, right? And that's a lot more difficult than most of us would like to admit. You know, I know there's a lot of people out there watching this lecture thinking, oh no, I think I could do that. I'd be pretty good at that. Trust me, it is very, very difficult. Okay. Now, moving back to anthropology and that whole fieldwork thing for a minute, anthropology had a couple of different ways of doing these involved observation or participant observation kind of things. Two of the kind of famous ones that the field of anthropology pioneered are ethnography and ethnomethodology, right? So an ethnography is kind of what I talked about earlier, where somebody from one group travels out to this other group and just kind of is able to talk about that group and how they view the world and what their religion is like and what their coming of age process is like for both boys and girls, and what their how they view marriage and how they view child rearing and how they view warfare and hunting and food and all these different things. So it's very much about like describing a culture or a group and telling us kind of how they live their lives, right? And again, this is very much where anthropology got its start. Similarly, but differently, is the ethnomethodology, which is much more, well, why? If they have this religion where they worship this particular god or set of gods or whatever, why? What is it about their situation, their environment, that caused a religion to grow like this? Or if they have this kind of ritual, why? What does that ritual or that ceremony or that thing bring to the group, and how did that social world come to be, right? So it's less about describing the social context and more about at least attempting to understand how that social context came to be in the first place, right? Some other things that are relatively common are things like a narrative analysis, right? And this is where you want to talk to people about some story. There was some event, and we want to get stories about, where were you? What did you do? How is your part in this wider story important, right? So maybe 9/11, right? 9/11 was this huge event that really affected the world, but especially the United States. So we want to know how people went through that day, right? So maybe we'll find some people who worked in the World Trade Center and some people who worked in the Pentagon and some, airline crew. And we're going to talk to them about that day and tell us that story. How did you, as best as you can remember, kind of minute by minute, how did that happen? And what did you think? And how did you feel? And what did you see? And what did you smell? And all those things. And it's kind of developing a story about an event based on how they tell you their story, right? As a big space nerd, I read a lot of these, right? Because there's book after book after book talking to astronauts about what it was like to go to the moon and how did you get selected as an astronaut and what was this like and what was that like. And it's, these books about kind of astronauts telling their story. And we can put those stories together and get a much better picture of what life was really like and what that event was really like and what that process really looked like and what was really important and what we can kind of get a better picture looking back on it maybe than we had at the time, right? You can also do a conversation analysis, right? This is where you kind of either record or just listen to two or more people having some kind of conversation. And then we want to kind of sit down and look at that conversation, see who said what and when and how. What kind of language did they use? Were they being respectful or were they being familiar? Who brought up certain topics first? And there's lots about how we talk to each other that is based on everything from culture to socialization to mood to age to respect to all kinds of different factors, just for instance, if people calling me Kevin versus people calling me Dr. Jennings as part of the conversation can indicate a lot about what is really happening in that conversation, and whether it's a really important conversation or whether it's just kind of two people chatting about nothing, right? You can also do a comparative analysis, right? So a comparative analysis is where you take two seemingly at least somewhat similar things, two or more, and then really dive into, are they similar or are they different, right? So maybe two tribal groups in the American Southwest, or two groups on the island of New Guinea, or two militia groups in 21st century United States or something. And we want to know, how are they similar and how are they different, right? Are they mostly focused on this aspect or that aspect? Do they see the world similarly, or do they have fundamental disagreements about religion or politics or the use of violence or whatever? And we want to kind of compare and contrast these two or more groups or people or ideas or whatever, right? Now, one of the more common kind of forms or features of qualitative research is the intensive interview, right? And this is more than just a 1 or 2 minute, hey, do you have time to talk to me about this thing? Oh, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? Okay, thank you, great. So an intensive interview is where, an interviewer, a trained interviewer, sits down with one or more people and has a long conversation lasting, many minutes to hours to even days, trying to learn more about that person or that group of people and how they view the world and how they view this specific thing or whatever. But it's full of like open-ended questions. So it's not just here's a question, pick one of these 4 options. It's much more like, tell me about your childhood. What was the relationship with your parents like? Describe your religious views, right? All these very open-ended questions that people can kind of give a little bit of information on or a lot of information on. Maybe that drives the future questions, right? But you don't want to move on to another subject, and then you don't want to end the interview until you've reached what's called a saturation point. That's where more questions, more digging, more kind of, oh, can you tell me more about that thing? Where that's not really getting you much more information, right? So with our first question about a certain subject, we're going to learn this much. And the second question about the same subject, we're going to learn more new stuff, but it's going to be less. And then the third question about the same rough subject, we're going to learn more, but it's going to be a little less. So at what point does the new information we're learning with each new question or each new interaction about this certain subject, at what point does that kind of really not get us much new information? That's the saturation point, and that's when we move on to another subject, or we end the interview, or whatever, when we're no longer gaining by keeping the interview really going, or at least going in that direction, right? When you do one of these interviews, you want to start with an outline of questions, but feel free to modify that outline on the fly. Add questions, switch the order of questions around, even delete questions, based on how the interview's going, what subjects they're bringing up in their answers, what subject leads into other subjects. But it can be helpful to have that outline. Just again, don't feel like it's a rule set. Don't feel like you have to ask all those questions in that order. You can't ask any more than, so the outline is there to help. It's there to be kind of a guide, but it's not, it's not the law, right? Often these intensive interviews are combined with some other kind of qualitative data gathering method, participant observation, complete participation, or complete observation. So you'll do the observation stuff, then do the intensive interview where you can talk about what you observed, right? Or you can do it the other way around. Do the intensive interview first with one or a few of the members that you're going to be observing, and then go in and do the participant observation, kind of armed with the knowledge you gained from that interview, right? And then if you do a group of people, you can do what's called a focus group, which we talked a little bit about in an earlier section. But this is where you take a group of, usually homogeneous group of people, so you want them similar to each other, not obviously exactly the same, because no two individuals are the same, but roughly similar people, say 8 to 10 usually for a good focus group, although that's not set in stone either. You sit them down and you do an intensive interview, not with one individual, but with the group, to try to get a better idea of how that kind of person would answer your questions, and how they view this thing that you're interested in, or how they kind of not how any one individual sees things or understands things, but how typical people of that type see things or understand things, right? Now, there's a couple of other ways to do this, and this can be used with quantitative analysis too. I contemplated putting this slide in with the quantitative analysis section. Then I thought, no, do it with qualitative. And I ended up here, but these techniques can be used either with quantitative or qualitative data. I just happened to put it here. So one of the things we want to look for, so unobtrusive measures, right? These are measures you can use, research you can use that kind of doesn't involve you going out and disturbing the situation. It involves you kind of just sitting back and watching, or looking, or coming in after the fact, and the participants or the people that you're observing, or the actions that you're observing, they have no idea you're there or will be there in the future, right? So a couple of these unobtrusive measures, there's physical trace evidence, right? So maybe we're interested in very minor crimes on the streets of some big city. So we want to go in and count the number of graffiti marks on the walls in different neighborhoods or on different streets in New York City. Or, maybe graffiti on subway cars in New York City. That's physical trace evidence from that deviance of using graffiti, right? Or maybe it's, littering. We want to drive down a bunch of different streets in the city and look at how much litter, discarded cigarette butts and discarded bottles and, other kind of trash and detritus and litter, that we can see as we're driving down each block of these different streets, so we can kind of have like a littering map of where more litter happens, where less litter happens, and maybe we're interested to see how that corresponds to more major crimes, so we can compare that later to reports of sexual assaults, or reports of drug behavior, or reports of even assaults, right? There's also archives, right? And this allows us to go not only a little bit into the past, but far into the past, right? We want to understand the Civil War, the American Civil War. What was a soldier's life really like? Well, obviously we can't interview them anymore because they're all long dead. So we have to go into the archives to see how they understood and experienced life as a soldier in the Civil War. So we might look back at, records, like official records. We might look back at, say, diaries that soldiers kept, letters they wrote, things like that, and go through those archives to understand and figure out as much as we can about what their lives were like and how they viewed the war and how they viewed the other side and how they, whether they missed their families or not, and, all those things. Another thing we can do is what's called a simple observation. This is where we either put ourselves or a camera or something in a place and then just observe what happens, right? So maybe we want to observe, how many people get upset at a retail checkout counter at a certain kind of store, right? So we set up a small camera and record all of the kind of customer and then employee interactions at a certain retail store, and see what customers seem to be getting upset, what customers get angry and start yelling or do this or do that, and then just kind of count and see, like, do people get more upset like right before lunch or right before closing, or is it fairly consistent throughout the day? Do they get more upset with female cashiers versus male cashiers or something like that, right? But that's just a simple observation. A contrived observation is where we purposefully set up kind of a scene and then do the observation part, either ourselves or with a camera or whatever, right? So maybe we put, a person in grungy clothing with a sign that says "homeless, please help," and we sit them down on a corner, and then we watch how people walking by react to them. And maybe we try this in like a bad neighborhood, and then a suburban neighborhood, and then a Wall Street, really high-end, rich downtown area, and see how the people in these different areas react to that person. But because we put that person there, because it's the same person every time with the same clothes and the same sign and all that stuff, we've created this situation and then observed. Thus, it's a contrived observation rather than, say, a simple observation. Does that make sense? I hope it does. All right, so two other kinds of sampling that are kind of new for qualitative analysis and different. And I found these interesting. There's more than just this. These are just the two I chose to kind of pull out and talk about. One here is theoretical sampling. And this is where we start doing our qualitative analysis. We start talking to people that are in this group. And based on the information that we learn from those initial members of our population, we decide to start pulling in people or elements of our population that we hadn't really thought of including before. But based on this initial thing, we're going to kind of go over to that group too, right? So maybe we're talking with drug users, right? So we start by looking at the urban poor. And we start asking them, how they got into drug using or drug selling, or, did you start with marijuana and then move up to cocaine, or did you start with cocaine, or whatever. And maybe they start talking about how, I used to be really rich until the drug made me poor, or I used to have a job on Wall Street. And we think, oh, wow, I wonder how many stockbrokers are doing this same drug, right? So I'm going to add some stockbrokers to my sample, and I'm going to go talk to them about their drug use. And they start talking about, how, my wife got me into this because she had done it. So, oh man, we don't have enough women. So we're going to add some women to this sample, right? So you're kind of adding or subtracting from the sample based on what you're learning from your initial observations and your initial measurements and your initial information that you're gathering. You think, oh, this information really makes me wonder how this happens with this other group that I wasn't necessarily sampling before. So I'm going to add them to the sample, or I'm going to start looking in this direction. And it's kind of a when we talked about quantitative methods and the samples they often use, the purposive sample, but it's purposive kind of on the fly and changes as you're gathering data, right? And then another kind of interesting example of a sampling method used with qualitative data is experience sampling. And this is they often use pagers. And I know some young people watching this video might not know what pagers are. So before cell phones, for about a 10-year period, there were pagers, and they were these little blocky things, and you would put them in your pocket or attach them to your purse or wear them on your belt or something. And then if somebody wanted to talk to you, but you weren't home for them to call, they could call the number for your pager and leave their number in return, and then your pager would beep or vibrate or whatever, and it would display the phone number that you were supposed to call. So you could find a phone, whether it was a pay phone or a friend's phone or whatever, and call that number and say, hey, somebody paged me, right? They're still at least semi in use, especially in things like hospitals. But if you ever gone to a restaurant and you had to wait for a table and they handed you a little thing and you held onto the thing, and then when that thing started blinking lights and buzzing and stuff, that meant your table was ready, so you could go back to the hostess and say, hey, my table's ready, and then they'd go seat you. That's a pager, right? But with experience sampling, basically we want to know what people spend their time thinking about or doing during the day, or how much of their time they spend doing this or that, or thinking about this or that or whatever. So basically we get people to be in our sample, get people to agree to be in our study, and then we give them a pager. And those pagers are set to go off kind of a random number of times a day and a random times per day. And we tell these people, every time this pager goes off, write down or record what you're thinking about, or what you're doing, or whether you're doing this or not doing this, or whether you're, whatever your mood is, or whatever we're interested in. And so it kind of becomes a way to randomly sample times of day and feelings and activities and all that stuff. And we can use this piece of technology to kind of automate that. And then at the end of the week or the end of the month or whatever, those people bring in their notes and they say, okay, I got paged at these times on these days, and here's what I was doing every time, or here's what I was thinking about every time, or whatever. All right, that's the end of our qualitative section. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you in the next one.